So Mario, what's this say?
My story?
Okay.
Acts.
So, David, what's it say?
My story, Acts
Right.
22.
My-
1,
my-
5.
So when I say my story, it's my story. You say my story, it's your story, right? So I'm not up here today talking about me. Hopefully, you will know what your story is. And if not, then you need to be praying about what your story is. Because this is about your story, not about my story. But right now it's about Paul's story. So that's where we're going to begin. So, we're in Acts in chapter 22, and we're going to be looking at the first 5 verses to begin with this morning, in which Paul says, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. As the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished." Let us pray. Lord, we thank you for your word this morning. May it not fall on deaf ears. May it not fall on hardened hearts. But may it transform us. May it change us from the inside out. In Jesus' name, amen. Do you all realize you have a story? If you didn't have a story, you wouldn't be here. Because everyone here, I believe, are believers. Okay? So you have a story to tell. Have you ever told your story? What is your story about coming to faith? Paul, as he begins talking and addressing the people, he uses the word, what? His defense. And actually, the word here is apologia that's used. And if you know that word, it comes from the word apologetics. Okay? And for those who saw the case for Christ, you understand that Lee Strobel went out to disprove the resurrection of Christ. And what he found out was he couldn't. The evidence was overwhelming that the resurrection took place. Okay, there was no denying it. Well, those facts is evidence, is apologetics. Used to be that apologetics was very effective in winning people to Christ. Today we're dealing with a different culture. And it's not necessarily the most effective way anymore to lead people to Christ. Because the facts doesn't necessarily mean anything to them anymore. And so he's defending his faith. Or when we tell our story, it's in defense of our faith as well. And when we tell our story, it's giving a reason for someone else to believe. Right? That's what he said. This is what happened to me. Can anybody tell you that you're a liar? How do they know what happened to you? Can anybody question what's gone on in your life? Testifying to the truth. The truth is you know it and what God has done in your life. Now this is really interesting because when he addresses the centurion, he speaks in Greek. And when he addresses his fellow countrymen, he speaks in Hebrew. Yet, his fellow countrymen knew Greek. So why would he speak in Hebrew to them? Have you ever heard this word? In mission circles, they talk about it, the mother tongue. They call it the heart language. When we were in Taiwan, the common language in the part of the island where we lived, in the southern part, was Chinese. They call it the trade language, okay?
Mandarin.
Yeah, Mandarin. Chinese, not Cantonese, but Mandarin. And the heart language among the people we were working with, though, was Taiwanese. What's that mean? Well, that's the language they're speaking in their homes, oftentimes. It's the language they're communicating with their loved ones. I mean, we have a culture here that probably a heart language is Spanish. Okay? They may know how to communicate in English, but maybe in their family or when they're talking to loved ones, they communicate in Spanish because that's their first language and that's their heart. That's how you reach your heart. And so in missions, what they want you to do when you go into a different culture, the best way of reaching the people is to learn not the trade language, but to learn their heart language, the one that touches their heart. And so that's why Paul, he's speaking in Greek, centurion, because that's his heart language, but then he turns around to his countrymen and he starts speaking in Hebrew, because that's their heart language. Something I learned as I was doing research on this topic that I did not realize, that Paul was an Hellenistic Jew. And you're like, what? What's that? It means he had a Greek background. He says he was born in Tarsus. Then he moved to Jerusalem. Well, Tarsus at the time, well, now it's modern-day Turkey, but at the time, it was part of Greece. And so I just find that interesting, because I always thought he was born and raised the whole time in Israel, and he wasn't. So he can speak. That gives him even better, better connection with the people, with the Gentiles and other people that he witnessed to. So in chapter 22, he's not preaching. He's telling his story. Well, I think all of us here pretty much know Paul's story, okay? Well, how did it begin? Well, he began by what? Persecuting Christians, right? And it's interesting because when he mentions who he studied under, Gamaliel, that name was one of the most respected Pharisees. He trained and learned under the best. But yet God saw something in him, didn't he? And we were talking this morning, it's interesting, Jesus, when he goes out and picks his disciples, he picks fishermen, he picks tax collectors, he picks people that, they know the scripture, but they're not experts like Pharisees are in the scripture. Yet after Jesus' resurrection, he seems to pick somebody totally opposite. This very people he ridiculed, he ends up choosing to be his missionary. How could that happen? Well, God saw something in Paul. Against from Bryce is if you haven't seen it, you gotta see it. It's such a great illustration, because people who are zealots against the Lord, when they become Christians, they become zealots for the Lord. It's like they're all in one way or the other. Where you have lukewarm people, and they come to Christianity, they're still lukewarm sometimes. And so sometimes the hardest people to win over to Christianity become some of the biggest proponents of Christianity. John chapter 9, verse 25. Who is this Jesus? Asked the Pharisees of the blind man whom Jesus had healed. And how did he respond? All I know is this. Once I was blind, and now I see. What's that? That's a testimony. That's a testimony. All I know is once I was blind, and now I see. And all because of this Jesus, right? Your testimony. Powerful defense. Apologia. If you try and convince people of something that the Bible says, oftentimes they're going to argue with you about it. Well, that's your Bible. You know, it's going to say what it says. That doesn't mean it's the truth or whatever, okay? They may argue, but they cannot argue with what God has done in your life.
Amen.
Someone can question what God's done in your life. Right? And everyone has that story of something that God has done in your life. Right? You go on and well, back in Acts 22, we go on and says, about noon as I came near Damascus, as Paul's telling his testimony or his story, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting, he replied. Don't you wish you all had that kind of revelation? But for many of us, it wasn't that clear, probably. But for Paul, it was. He's on the Damascus Road, and he's blinded by this light. And he has to go, they have to lead him into town to go see Ananias, who the Lord had spoken to restore his sight. Right? So God using, again, one of his disciples to do ministry. And Paul was transformed by revelation. Instead of persecuting Christians, now he is about to go out and convince people that Jesus is real. And he could witness literally to what he has seen and heard. Now, I think all of us have experiences with God that we have seen and that we have heard and that we can tell others about, right? Great question. What better question? What does this question illustrate? What shall I do, Lord? It knocked a man, a Pharisee, with an enormous amount of pride and literally dropped him to his feet. In fact, when he saw the light, he was dropped to his knees in humility. And when we say that, or when we ask that question, Lord, what shall I do? That demonstrates our humility before Christ. Our willingness to do what he wants. Our willingness to give up our selfishness and serve the Lord. And so what's the Lord say? Get up, go to Damascus. They'll be told what you'll be assigned to do. So does it answer his question? Not really. What's God do? He tells him the next step. But what do we want to know? We want to know the end. Why does God only tell us the next step? I think it's faith. When you don't know what you're going to do, and God says, he just tells us the next step. And I can't tell you how many times he's done that with me. He just tells me the next step, but I want to see the end. I want to see what's going to come out from it, right? What do you want from me? You ever ask the Lord that? What do you want for me? See how it's a little bit different? What do you want from me? What do you want for me? What do you want to do in me? Or what do you want to do through me? And again, talking some more about blessing, right, Ernie? That's God working through us. What do you want to do through me? How do you want me to bless? What do you want me to do? And in this case, he just says, go. Go into the city. And he had people let him into the city. He couldn't see. He was blind. And there you'll get further instructions. This has never happened to you, right? Has this ever happened to you? God just gives you the next step. He just says, go, do this. And then you'll find out more. One step at a time. One instruction. Obedience. When God was leading us to leave Taiwan, all he was saying is leave. But God, where do you want me to go? Just leave. Just one step. Just leave. And that's the way he works. Okay? Are you faithful with that one step? Well, if you're not faithful with one step, he doesn't give you the next step. Because what good is it, right? Faithful with one step, then he gives you the next step. I think he purposely does this because sometimes it may overwhelm us if we really knew what was going to happen. So, and for Paul, it was take the light to the Gentiles. That was his ultimate mission. But first, he had to be led in the city. Then, the disciple Ananias had to come, remove the scales from his eyes. And there were steps, continuing steps along the way before he finally led the light to the Gentiles, or took the light to the Gentiles. In Hebrews says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Mm-hmm. Didn't know where he was going. God calls him out. Said, okay. Packs everything up and leaves. And follows. That's faith. Lord calls. Does he want to bless us? If he calls us into something, yeah. God, Lord wants to bless us, but it requires obedience on our part to follow him. Encouraging us to step of faith, which we must obey one step at a time. Why do we always want to know what's going to happen? We don't like uncertainty, do we? I talk about tour bus guides. A good tour bus guide will always tell you what's coming up next. Because people want to know. They don't like uncertainty. They don't like surprises. They want to know. And so you say, okay, we're going to stop at this place there, and after we leave here, we're going to go, somewhere else. So you know what's coming up. Because you don't want to be caught off guard. We want to know. If we knew how it was going to work, it wouldn't be faith. Would it? It wouldn't be faith. If we knew where the resources would come from, it wouldn't be faith. If we had it all mapped out and knew the outcome, it would be faith. I'm always one of those, I like plan A, okay, and a plan B, right? If plan A is God, then why do we have a plan B?
Right.
When we were preparing to go to the mission field, we owned a house in Tucson, and I wanted to rent it out. Because that was my plan B. Hey, if it doesn't work out, at least we've got a place to come back and live, right? Logically, it makes sense, I thought. Janae goes, no, we're supposed to sell it. I said, yeah, but then what happens if it doesn't work out? And she goes, I think we're supposed to sell it. I said, okay, I'll pray about it. You know what God said? Sell it! Sell it! I said, okay. So we sold it in July, was it 2005?
Yes.
In October, the market fell, dropped down. We sold the house at the peak of the market. To this day, they're talking 2005, to this day, the house is not worth as much as what we sold it for. 12 years later. I didn't know it was going to happen. God knew. I didn't know. Amazing how he knows those things, isn't it? Okay. Who's here that doesn't know Jesus? So if you know Jesus, you got a story. Right? Was that your question this morning, Ernie? Pretty much, wasn't it? How do I share my faith? Well, I'm glad you asked. You share your story, your testimony. 3 parts. First, what were you like before you met Christ? some of the questions you could ask. I'm sorry. What was my life? What was my, not my wife like? What was my life like before you knew Christ? What was your life like? Okay. I can share a little bit about my life. Going on deployments with the fighter squadron and playing drinking games and getting promoted and spending promotion before I ever got it, thinking, oh, if I buy this truck, I'm going to be happy. If I buy this, I'm going to be happy. You know, and keep trying. That was the way my life was. I had a void that I could not fill. An emptiness that could not be filled by material things. What did my life revolve around? Me. My happiness.
Yeah.
Me. Was I happy? No. Did I have joy? No. Right? But buying material things initially made me happy, but it was short-lived. It's kind of like sin or temptation. Temptation would be real if it didn't give you some temporary satisfaction. But then it's empty after that, right? And so that was it. You know, it only gave you satisfaction for a short period of time. And then it was gone. But these are questions that you can, you know, as you're preparing your own story, think about. What was my life like before I knew Christ? What was it like? Did you have it together? Was everything perfect? Was there any areas that you were let down in? And then what do you think the next part of your testimony? Once you receive Christ, before, receive, and then after, right? How were you exposed to Jesus? How were you exposed to the gospel? How were you exposed? You know, did somebody bring you to faith? Did somebody witness to you? Do you see a billboard? You know, people, TV, radio, you know, maybe different ways. But how did you come to Jesus? And I have to see, because I grew up in the church, but then as a teenager and years in the military, wasn't following Jesus. We moved to Austin, Texas, and our 8-year-old daughter comes to me and asks me, why don't we go to church? You know why she asked that question, Ray? Because her grandparents took her to church when she visited them. That's why she asked us that question. And then she comes back and like, why don't we go to church? You know what my answer was? I don't know. Because I was brought up in the church, I don't know. I don't know why. So, what did we do? We decided to find a church. Meantime, our neighbor is witnessing to Janae. And we found out from her a church to start, you know, to try out and start going to. And we went to that church and we liked it. It was a good little church. So that was my reaction. I said, well, I don't have an answer. So let's start going. Looking back, I know God put us in that house for a reason because of that neighbor who was witnessing to Janae. How did she witness to you? I mean, did she beat you over the head with the Bible?
No, she was the ultimate neighbor that came over with cookies and, you know, the day that we're moving and just being sweet.
Yeah, demonstrating the love of God. That's what she did. And then she invited you to a Bible study or something later on. But yeah, just befriending and so forth. I'm not really sure my attitude changed then. In fact, I'm trying to reflect back, when did my attitude change? And I think it was probably not until after we moved to Tucson. I was baptized in Tucson.
We were sprinkled at the Methodist church.
Yeah.
But we were submerged in
Yeah. Why? Why did any of you accept Christ? Maybe you think that there had to be a better way. Yeah. You know, why do we accept Christ? Because we're looking maybe for the hope. So we realized that, at least for me, the void wasn't being filled. It was in my life, or in my heart. Why did I accept Christ? Because you come to a realization maybe you can't do it all on your own anymore. Well, I think for me, as far as how has Christ changed me is, yes, I'm still selfish in some areas, but by putting Christ first, the rest of my life was blessed. My marriage was blessed. People who enter into a marriage and think that your partner is the one that's going to solve all your issues and all your problems and make you whole, you're severely going to be deceived, and it ain't going to work out. And once I realized that Janae she could no way meet all the demands I was placing on her, that only God could. And then once we made God first, then our marriage was blessed. Motivated differently? Well, I was going to say, well, if it wasn't motivated differently, I wouldn't be here. But that goes beyond just, being a believer. It goes in the fact that I don't know if I'd have in my heart that I wanted to serve people if it wasn't for Christ. When you share your testimony, it's not your job to save whoever you're sharing your testimony to. You cannot rescue people. Only God can. Only the Holy Spirit can. Our role is to share our story, not to save people. Only God can save people. So no matter what the response is to your testimony, do not take it personally, and don't believe that you were a failure if the person doesn't immediately accept Christ. Because for many people, they need to hear 10, 12 times the gospel presented to them before they finally accept it. You may just be one in that chain. You may never see the fruit. It doesn't mean the fruit won't come. We are blessed when we have an opportunity to see the fruit. But oftentimes, we won't see the fruit. But never think that you're a failure if you share your love for Christ and your story and somebody doesn't accept Christ as a result. And people give you opportunities all the time to share. How can you be so happy in this miserable place? Maybe it's at work or whatever. I don't understand. Why aren't you complaining like everybody else here? What makes you different? Why don't you have, money issues? Or why don't you, whatever it may be? Would anybody ever ask you the opportunity to share? Well, you know what? I was like you. I had the same issues. I had the same problems. I used to go out and drink, with people. But you know what? It didn't bring me any joy. It didn't bring me any satisfaction. Let me tell you what did bring me joy and satisfaction. That was the day I accepted the Lord in my life. Bridges. Well, look for those bridges. Meet people where they're at. Just like Paul says in Athens, I see you have a tomb to the unknown God. Well, let me tell you who the unknown God is. Well, what's he do when he's preaching to the Jews? Moses is their hero, so he starts with Moses. Let me talk to you about the patriarchs. Let me tell you about Moses. Let me tell you about Abraham. In Genesis it talks about the coming Lord. It talks about Jesus all the way back in Genesis. You just find those bridges where you can meet people where they're at, and then you can share your story. Does that make sense? Well, yes, maybe. Everybody's fainting for lack of food. Did that help you, Ernie, to write out your testimony? Yeah. I asked Ernie wanted to share his testimony, and he did. It was really good a few weeks ago. And I suggested to him write it out, because when you write it out first, it helps organize your thoughts. Okay, and get your thoughts organized. And then the way you speak, and the best thing is to read it out loud to see if it sounds like the way you speak. Prepare, practice, and deliver. Okay, just like anything. Don't just wing it. 3 minutes. I think you're a little longer, but that's okay. I still love you. When you're in front of the church like this, 10-minute testimony is okay. But oftentimes when you're in conversation with somebody, you may only have them for a few minutes. And so you can have a longer version, but you should really have prepared about a 3-minute version that you just share in dialogue, conversation, and it's not just something you rehearse. Okay, I've got to say this all the way through, or I'm not going to remember it. No. It should be something coming out of your heart. It should be something natural. It should be something part of the conversation you're in, and that you're not preaching, you're not teaching, you're sharing a story. What God has done in your life. It's not, what's that term? It's not, anyway. I forgot. It's not, anyway, it's not, it should not be difficult, okay? It's not astrophysics, it's not, yeah. So what is your story? Why are you here this morning? What brought you here? Don't say your car.
Another step in the story.
Yeah, another step. As we were reading in Scripture this morning that Paul and Apollos, and by the division in the church in Corinth, and it says, you don't follow the teachings of Paul, or you follow the teachings of Apollos, or you decide on whose teachings you're following. You follow the teachings of Christ. And Paul and Apollos were here, to plant the seed and water. But only God can make it grow. And that's true here. I'm here to plant the seed and help water the seed. But it's up to you and God to make it to grow and to produce fruit. Okay? So it's time of invitation. If anybody has any prayer needs, please come forward and let me know, or after church. Carrie and Janae in the back if you'd like to pray with them, or any requests as we listen to this next song.